Starting the show with the latest from Gaza, which Israel claims its forces have cut into two. The claim comes even as Israeli jets bombed over 450 targets in the narrow strip. The death toll in Gaza has crossed the 10,000 mark. Israel's military claims it has encircled Gaza City, backed by airstrikes and some gunfire from warships offshore. The troops have divided the besieged coastal strip into two, cutting the region in two parts, a south and a North Gaza. With the ground invasion gaining momentum, the toll is likely to rise on both sides. Israel says its forces have encircled Gaza City. The army says its ground troops have killed several Hamas fighters while taking a militant compound containing observation posts, training areas and underground tunnels. Israel says it has lost 31 of its own soldiers since it began expanding the ground operations in Gaza on October 27th. The troops were fighting hundreds of Hamas fighters who believe they can hold off Israel's advance in the wall of tunnels under the enclave. Israeli troops are engaged in house-to-house combat as we speak, as tanks and armored bulldozers charge through the sand. But with Israel claiming to cut Gaza into two parts, the question which now remains to be answered is what happens to the myriad of tunnels under Gaza which are used by the Hamas militants? Will the Israeli troops being able, or will they be able to bulldoze their way through the notorious Gaza metro? Also, if the tunnels continue to operate and connect to both sides of Gaza, does the line drawn and controlled by the Israeli forces on ground even matter? Dov Zakhaim is former Undersecretary of Defense in George W. Bush administration and currently senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Is now joining us live from Washington, D.C. Mr. Dov, welcome to the show. The death toll is over 10,000 in Gaza. The international community says there is no justification over Israel's relentless strikes because the civilian casualties is much more than the actual militants being targeted. What's your projection of this conflict? Where is it headed in real sense?
Well, where it's headed, of course, is not entirely clear because the Israeli government has yet to make it clear. There are certain things, though, that are obvious. The first is you've got more than 250 hostages, hopefully still alive, in the hands of Hamas. And the top priority is to get them out. And the Israelis will not stop until they get them out. So that's priority number one. The world is criticizing Israel. It's talking about proportionality, but the Israelis haven't taken any hostages, leaving aside the fact that they haven't beheaded children and done all the other horrible things that are reminiscent of the Holocaust that Hamas did to start all of this. But number one is getting the hostages out, and they'll continue as long as that's necessary. Number two is destroying the tunnels, making sure that Hamas cannot use the tunnels. And as you've just said, this is a highly complex operation because there are so many of them, hundreds of miles of tunnels. Whether the tunnels can be essentially cut off from the north, I think the Israelis have concluded that if they destroy all the tunnels in the north, the ones in the south are much less threatening. So they'll try to do that. The challenge for them, of course, is that they don't know whether the hostages are being kept in those tunnels. If that wasn't the case, they could simply use a variety of weapons to essentially blow everybody out of the tunnels. But they can't do that because the hostages may be there. Mm-hmm. So that's priority number two. And priority number three, clearly, is to eliminate the leadership of Hamas once and for all, to get rid of this terrorist leadership that has persecuted its own people, withheld everything from fuel to money from Qatar in order to build tunnels instead of improving the lives of its citizens. And of course, continuing to threaten Israel and frankly, Jews all around the world. All right. So those are the top three priorities. That's going to take time. What happens after that, I believe, is still an open question. And I think that that is one of the major issues that President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken and other American officials, and not just American officials, are pressing the Israelis. because clearly
Mr.
something
Dole,
has to be done.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about
Yes.
what you're alluding to, where President Joe Biden and U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken have been involved in diplomacy, we understand, in West Asia. Some critics argue that despite the diplomatic efforts by the United States, it is still not the ideal deal breaker to the conflict. There was hope that maybe Turkey or even Egypt would have been the likely peace brokers, but that hope is slowly diminishing. In your view, who or what country can pull all the strings in this war and emerge as a mediator, and why?
Well, I think the United States is still in the best position to do that for a very simple reason. We provide aid to the Israelis. And the Israelis, the Israeli government, I should say, because you have to distinguish between this extreme right-wing government and the people of Israel, who, as you know, were demonstrating against this government in the hundreds of thousands before the war broke. The government of Israel is still not committed to a two-state solution, is still not committed to any hope for the ordinary people of Gaza. And there's only one country in the world that can pressure them, and that's the United States. And so far, we have not pressured them. We have not threatened them. We have not said to them, look, if you want our support as you try to rescue your hostages, as you try to destroy tunnels, as you try to eliminate the leadership of Hamas, if you want that support, we need for you to change your policies on the West Bank, to have a vision as to what to do about Gaza, and ultimately to be willing to deal with a two-state solution. We haven't done that, but we're the only country in the world in the position to do it.
Mr. Dove, finally, and I want your brief response to this one. Israeli Prime Minister is adamant that a ceasefire is not a possibility right now. Now that the ground invasion on Gaza is seemingly on course, the human cost is likely to explode. In your assessment, will it be easy to fully eliminate Hamas militants? And if a ceasefire was to be announced right now, who will bear the cost? Who will bear the damage?
Well, if a ceasefire was called right now, you've got the hostages still there, number one. Number two, you have the Hamas leadership still there, and you have the tunnels still there. The only way that a ceasefire could work really would have to be a temporary one where the hostages are actually released. Once the hostages are released, once these people and children, remember, we're talking about little children as little as 3 years old, are returned to their families, then I think we could start thinking about what are the other things Israel must do, and frankly, the Arab world must do in order to create a Gaza that is really serving its own citizens.
All right, I've been talking to Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Mr. Dov Zakhaim. Thank you for talking to us today.
Thank you for having me.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.